Without a front, flanks, or rear, we fought a formless war against a formless enemy who evaporated like the morning jungle mists, only to materialize in some unexpected place. It was a haphazard, episodic sort of combat. Most of the time, nothing happened. But when something did, it happened instantaneously and without warning. That was Philip Caputo talking about his experience in Vietnam as a Marine vet. We weren't on the wrong side. We are the wrong side. That was from Daniel Ellsberg in 1974. And finally, some people say that nothing could be done about Vietnam. That may be true, but I say this: if you can't help them, at least don't hurt them. That was Forrest Gump from 1994.
Welcome back to APUSH for All. I think we should probably stop here to recognize that this is our 10th episode, and I would guess not a lot of people expected us to, make it this far. So congrats to us.
This is huge.
Yeah, boy. 10 episodes.
Yeah,
This is epic.
We're kind of like an institution at this point.
Yeah.
Well, didn't you get an email the other day from somebody?
I did. They were definitely fishing to try to steal our money, but still, we got an email asking if we were interested in like podcast marketing because, as the email said, not many podcasts make it past the first few episodes or attract such a large following.
Whoa.
Rarefied air. That's what we're living in right now.
Now, to be clear, they did follow up with that with trying to talk us into buying some services. So
And you bought them, right?
of course,
this is
yeah.
a big deal.
It's you
Okay,
got to
all
go
right.
big, right?
Just let me know what I owe you.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
But just the offer. I mean, that's
Yeah.
they could have been lying, but still 10 episodes. I really think that people didn't think this would happen.
No, but yet here we are. We proved them all wrong.
That's right.
I would give you guys a high five, but that seems kind of half baked.
We can do it.
What about a high 10?
High 10.
High-
All right.
What?
Ready?
Here,
1, 2,
three.
3.
Oh,
Oh, that was really bad. I
that
don't
was
even know.
okay.
If,
I think it worked.
That was weak.
No one
Okay.
saw it.
All right.
Okay, so again, congrats to us. If you've been with us since the beginning, thanks for coming along with us on this journey. And there's more to come. And I think everyone should look forward to that.
if you guys want to send us anything to congratulate us on our 10th episode, just know that we're accepting of cakes, cookies. Garrison really likes sweet stuff.
I do.
But
chips.
also, chips, anything that you want to send us, cards, well wishes, feel free.
I like a box of chocolates.
Excellent. And topical, and that helps us transition back to the quotes that we started this episode with. Some iconic quotes and voices from an era of American history that is still much debated. Of course, we're speaking about the Vietnam War. It was a war without victory, without really clear heroes or villains, and it was really without any type of closure, which is why we're still discussing it today. It tore at the seams of American society and it raised haunting questions about government, sacrifice, and truth. It left a legacy we're still unpacking.
In this episode, we're going to go all the way back to figure out what the roots of U.S. involvement were. We'll begin with French colonialism, and then we'll examine the rise and fall of South Vietnamese President Diem, the escalation under Kennedy and Johnson's administrations, and Nixon's so-called peace with honor.
From there, we'll spotlight the cultural aftermath, movies, music, the protest that defined a generation, plus the war's final act, the Fall of Saigon. By the end, we'll connect this conflict to the major APUSH themes like America and the world, politics and power, and national identity.
Vietnam's story starts long before American boots hit the ground. In the 19th century, Vietnam was absorbed into the growing French colonial empire and became part of French Indochina. So the whole region, Southeast Asia, also included Laos and Cambodia. And for decades, the French imposed economic exploitation and political control while suppressing Vietnamese nationalism. Classic imperialism move here. But after World War II, that spirit of nationalism surged, and Ho Chi Minh, leader of the Viet Minh, which were Vietnamese nationalists, that independence movement, emerged as a key figure. And here's something surprising for many students of US history: Ho Chi Minh was not always anti American.
Exactly right. He lived in Europe in Europe and the United States, and he really came to admire the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence. In fact, when the Japanese surrendered in 1945, ending their wartime occupation of Vietnam and all of Indochina, Ho seized the moment, and so on September 2nd, 1945, he stood before a massive crowd in Hanoi and read the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. The opening lines were borrowed pretty much word for word from Thomas Jefferson. And quote, all men are created equal. The Creator has given us certain inviolable rights: the right to life, the right to be free, and the right to achieve happiness. This immortal statement was made in the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America in 1776. That is what the United States has declared. That is what Vietnam demands. And again, he said this in 1945.
He even sent several letters to President Harry Truman requesting U.S. support for Vietnamese independence and warning about French colonial occupation. Truman never responded, and the U.S. was now deep in the Cold War, prioritizing alliances, even flawed ones, to contain communism. And France, who had been the colonial overlord of Indochina for quite some time, was a key ally of the United States.
So instead of backing Ho Chi Minh's anti colonial movement, the U.S. backed the French, setting the stage for decades of conflict. It's one of the great ironies of the Vietnam War. A revolutionary leader, inspired by America's founding ideals, ultimately becomes its enemy.
And what do we always say, you guys? Context is
Key.
key. It's everything. Everything we talk about that continually in class. So it's the height of the Cold War, and it's the Red Scare in the 1950s. So ultimately, the U.S. has to view Ho Chi Minh, or they doesn't have to view him, but they viewed Ho Chi Minh as a communist threat. So after the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and signed the Geneva Accords, which temporarily, one, divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, and then also called for national elections to reunify. Oh my God, that was a tough word.
You okay?
The country. The U.S. supported the creation of a separate non-communist government in the South. Those elections were never held.
Right. Those were supposed to take place 2 years after the Geneva Accords were signed in 1956. The elections were supposed to take place in 1956. They never do. And the U.S. is going to prop up No Dinh Diem's government in South Vietnam. He was a Catholic, but he was in a Buddhist majority nation, meaning that he was deeply unpopular, and he also was pretty repressive to the Buddhist religion. He, as in Diem, jailed opponents, ignored peasant needs, and even sparked self-immolations by Buddhist monks in protests. And there are videos of this. This was on American TV. It was on the front page of American newspapers of these Buddhists burning themselves to death in protest of Diem's rule.
By 1963, Kennedy had sent 16,000 quote unquote advisors, mostly as a way to prop up South Vietnam and Diem. These are Green Berets, CIA operatives, military trainers, and officially they're there just simply to advise. Unofficially, they were probably doing more to prepare for combat. That same year, tacitly with U.S. approval, South Vietnamese generals will assassinate Diem.
And so this is from a cable from Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge in 1963. He says, "There's no way Diem can be saved. It's clear we must withdraw support. The generals are moving." I got to tell you guys, we never choose very well when we install someone to be the American face in foreign situations. I mean, we saw this in Guatemala. You'll see this in Iran, and it's clear that it's not working out in Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah. I was
Down.
trying to think of a time when we have put someone as the American face in another country.
I mean, you could argue that what the United States was trying to do during the Cold War was replicate our success in Japan and Western Germany after
Mhm.
World War II, where we could create pro capitalist democracies that were in some ways mirroring our society, future trade partners. Those two nations end up becoming powerful allies today. So in some ways, there's a model for this, but it can't be a one size fits all. And we clearly didn't understand Indochina and Vietnam as well as we thought.
Well, and we were just, I mean, on the wrong side, supporting a government that was not democratic whatsoever. Just because they were anti communist didn't mean that they were democratic. So after Kennedy's assassination in 1963, chronology,
Matters.
thank you, Lyndon Johnson is going to inherit this quagmire. And Vietnam's often referred to as a quagmire. And for those of you out there who are unsure about a quagmire, this is like a sticky or difficult situation that there seems to be no way out of.
And 2 episodes ago, we said we were going to do a word of the day. Do you remember this?
Yeah, word of the episode.
Word
It's
of the episode.
quagmire.
It's gonna be. I think this time it should be Quagmire. Didn't you have a
Quagmire.
song that you sang?
Word of the episode. Word of the episode.
That was it.
Quagmire.
ASMR.
ASMR. Now I know what that is.
Quagmire.
Just a fun word.
It is.
So the tipping point of this quagmire came in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And allegedly, North Vietnamese boats fired on 2 U.S. ships who were just off of the coast of North Vietnam. And this second attack may never have happened based on radar ghosts and confusion.
Still, despite the ambiguities that weren't really made clear at the time, it was reported as a direct assault, an act of war. Congress will pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and give LBJ essentially a blank check to wage war. But this comes without a formal declaration. We never actually go to war in Vietnam, and this will set a dangerous precedent. War by resolution, so we're kind of bypassing Congress here, and these war powers it represent a shift that very much still echoes today.
Yeah, remember that blank check with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution for when we get to the end of Vietnam. That'll be important. And one thing also that my students pointed out the other day, they said, Miss Kellner, it seems that like sometimes when we need to enter a war, we kind of find a way to do it. We find a justification to do that. And I thought that was a very astute observation. They pointed out the Mexican American War, whether, the Americans really crossed the Rio Grande in 1848 and fought a war after that. They also brought up the sinking of the Lusitania. They brought up the Spanish American War with the Maine. So, change in continuity, everybody. Some continuities here.
You can also think about how in all of those wars you mentioned, there were voices of opposition that were in the minority at the time who will later be seen as somewhat visionary. I mean, you've got Lincoln with the famous spot resolution speech. A junior senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, will similarly make his anti-war positions known. So it's always interesting to go back and see who at the time was really questioning the motives and questioning the wisdom of going to war, because oftentimes those voices look pretty prescient when you look backward.
Yeah, and certainly there were people doing that at the beginning of Vietnam, but nowhere near to the extent that anti war voices will become by the middle or definitely by the end of this conflict. And so by 1968, the U.S. had over 500,000 troops in Vietnam, but it wasn't like World War II because there were no front lines. The Viet Cong, this was a group of North Vietnamese allies in South Vietnam, they used guerrilla tactics, booby traps, underground tunnels, and blended in with civilians.
And this became such a problem for American GIs. James McGarvey, who was with the U.S. Army, says this: every night we'd go into the village. During the day, they'd smile and sell us rice. At night, they'd shoot at us. We couldn't tell who the enemy was. And this was a common experience for the American soldier.
And this led to an enormous amount of confusion. And through this confusion, you had a series of moral disasters, like the My Lai massacre in 1968, when U.S. troops killed something like 500 or more unarmed civilians. And the military tried to cover this up, but ultimately, when this news comes out, Americans are shocked and they don't really understand how it is that American soldiers are capable of such violence. But really, it just goes to show how disconnected American audiences were from the front lines.
And then came the Tet Offensive, which was a massive coordinated North Vietnamese attack during a ceasefire. They were supposed to, the Tet is Vietnamese New Year. And so traditionally there had been a ceasefire during this time. And this happened in 1968. So the U.S. repelled it as best they could. It's seen as not a loss for the United States, but a lot of psychological and moral damage was done to the U.S. war effort.
Absolutely. And so what a bombshell. I think a lot of people felt like they'd been kind of rocked back on their heels. Walter Cronkite, probably the America's most trusted news anchor, said after Tet, "It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate." And for him to for you to hear something like that from Walter Cronkite, who was everybody's news anchor, was, oh my God, where do we go from here?
Yeah, it shook the nation. And LBJ reportedly told aides after that, he said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost middle America."
The aftermath of the Tet Offensive marked a turning point. Public support for the war plummets, and so too did confidence in President Johnson. So, just weeks later, in March of 1968, LBJ stunned the nation by announcing he would not seek re election.
And that's going to open the door to one of the most turbulent elections in American history, the election of 1968. Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother, entered the Democratic race but was tragically assassinated in the summer of 1968. Then comes Eugene McCarthy, who was running on an anti war platform, who had gained some early momentum, but the nomination ultimately goes to Hubert Humphrey, who was Johnson's vice president and also very closely tied to the Johnson administration's war policies.
So at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, which was held in Chicago, absolute chaos occurs. Outside, thousands of anti-war protesters clash violently with police, while inside the convention hall, the party was deeply divided. It was broadcast live, a political meltdown happening in real time, and the refrain that you heard from protesters as officers were swinging batons on national TV is the whole world is watching. The whole world is watching. And indeed, if you think about this, the people that we were adamantly opposed to, the communists, the Soviets, they're looking at this and they're just like, we couldn't write better propaganda than this.
Yeah, and 1968 is oftentimes considered to be one of the most chaotic years in American history. You have the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who presumably would have won the Democratic nomination for the 68 election. Who's to say if he would have won the election or not in November? You also have the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. that year. And with all this happening with the Vietnam War, this is the living room war where it's being shown on TV. There's body counts every night on TV. People are watching, the amount of American soldiers who are dying, the amount of Vietnamese who are dying, and this is really jarring for a lot of people. So for the Republicans on the other side, Richard Nixon is going to run, and he promised law and order at home and also a peace with honor to try to end this conflict in Vietnam. He also really tried to appeal to a group that he would refer to as the silent majority. And these are people who he claimed were not out in the streets protesting. They were paying their taxes, they were doing the right thing, being good citizens, and who felt that the country was really losing its way.
This message really struck a chord, and as a result, Nixon narrowly won the 1968 election. Once he gets into office, he shifts the United States strategy in Vietnam. One of his first major policy changes was reforming the draft, which had become a flashpoint for the anti war protest. The new system moved to a draft lottery in 1969 using birthdays to determine the order of conscription. This was an attempt to try to make it more fair and reduce tensions, but actually it's just going to lead to more widespread protests because now you've got a lot of middle class college kids who are suddenly being sent to Vietnam.
And it was that was being played out on TV. I mean, you had the bingo ball basket rolling around, and everybody watched. And I know, Ms. Kellner, you brought this up, and Dr. Garrison, you have too, when we talked about civil rights. What was it that made it so effective? Is because everything is optics now. Everything is on TV, and you're not just reading about protest; you're seeing it, and those are two very different things.
Well, and Dr. Garrison, you mentioned young college kids are being drafted, but yeah, it's one thing to be drafted, but that it's another thing to actually serve and to go to Vietnam on the front lines because there were ways to get out of the draft. There were ways, you could defer if you were a college student, which was something that was reserved for more privileged Americans. Race was playing a big part of that at this time in American history. You could also get medical deferments, but again, you would have to have some means to go to a doctor and have that. So this war is definitely not fought equally amongst socioeconomic groups or races.
Yeah, I've always said that you can learn a lot about America's socioeconomics in the 1970s by looking at who actually ends up fighting that war. It's mostly poor, working class, and minorities who are sent and shipped over to Vietnam. And the number of people who will end up coming to power in later years who found ways to avoid service. Uh, it's quite interesting that they are the ones who will later condemn Vietnam, a war that they were able to avoid. So that's just an interesting way to kind of think about how the draft is so instructive.
Yeah. And so obviously there's a lot of, angry voices, rightfully so, at the end of the 60s about this conflict. And so Nixon comes up with his policy called Vietnamization, which was his plan to gradually withdraw US troops and turn over military responsibility for this war strictly to the South Vietnamese and their army called the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. And this was the idea that, the South Vietnamese should defend their own country with US aid, but not US lives or US troops.
Which I think, from Nixon's perspective, it was going to ratchet down the opposition and the protests. This should make more people happy. However, at the same time, Nixon escalates the war behind the scenes by secretly bombing Cambodia and Laos, hoping to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines, which kind of snaked through those countries on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But these actions would come back to haunt him and the country as protests reignited with even greater force.
So this war wasn't just fought in jungles, it was fought in college quads, record stores, and movie theaters. The anti-war movement simply exploded everywhere in American life.
So you got SDS, which was Students for a Democratic Society, that would, take a page out of the Civil Rights Playbook and stage teach-ins. Protesters chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And draft resistance grew. Young men burned draft cards. Muhammad Ali refused the draft, who he famously said, "I got no quarrel with them Viet Cong." And which reflects your point that you made, Dr. Garrison, about there were a lot of minorities who were like, "Why am I getting sent over to defend freedom and all of that stuff in Southeast Asia?" UC Berkeley protester in 1967 says this: "We are the people who are going to die. We have a right to say no."
In 1970, the war spilled into Cambodia under Nixon's direction. Students elevated their protests, and this all comes to a head at Kent State University, where National Guardsmen fired into a largely peaceful crowd, with the shots killing 4 students. The moment was immortalized in Neil Young's song, Ohio.
I think we know this one, don't
Yeah,
we?
we got that.
Okay,
Pretty
here we
good.
go. Right. One,
Two.
two, two, three, four.
Tin soldiers and Nixon coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming. 4 dead in Ohio.
It's so good.
That was great. We're
And
gonna have to go back and listen to that, but I feel good. Yeah.
also, people don't recognize this as much, but there was another shooting, also a similar situation at Jackson State University in Mississippi. So Kent State is the one that usually gets the attention, but in the South there was also a very similar incident. So lots of music. We just heard the famous song that Neil Young wrote for Crosby, Stills and Nash. But there's a ton of other music, which was really the heartbeat of this movement. Of course, "Fortunate Son" by Creedence Clearwater Revival,
Love it.
"Give Peace a Chance" by John Lennon, "I Feel Like I'm Fixin' to Die," Rag, "Country Joe and the Fish," "What's Going On" by Marvin Gaye. All of them voicing a generation's grief and rage.
Yeah, and what I love to do is play CCR's "Fortunate Son" and show the lyrics, because that idea of "I ain't no senator's son,"
Right.
right?
It ain't me.
It ain't me. This is a
Yeah.
class argument. Like,
Yep.
this is really, if you listen to the lyrics, it's a class argument and an anti-war song. It's really great. And it's later that we see a whole host of movies try to capture what it was like to be in Vietnam, what it was like to be alive in the 1970s. And some of those, for example, Platoon by Oliver Stone, who was himself a veteran. Apocalypse Now, with some of those haunting scenes in the jungle. And then, of course, Born on the 4th of July, where Tom Cruise played a disillusioned vet based on a true story. All of these movies are just synonymous with the war, but also with American cinema history.
And so by the early 70s, the protests weren't just about the draft or casualties. They were fueled by something deeper, this growing mistrust of the government.
Simply put, many Americans felt they were being lied to. The term credibility gap starts appearing everywhere, and it basically referred to this idea that there was a gap between what the government said and what people actually believed.
And this mistrust is going to explode in 1971 with the release of the Pentagon Papers by the New York Times. And these were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, who we heard from earlier at the beginning of the podcast. And he was a former Defense Department analyst.
Quote, "These papers show that the government had long misled the public about the scope and goals of the war across multiple presidencies."
The papers revealed secret bombings, fake attacks, and failed strategies. They showed leaders knew the war was essentially unwinnable, but kept fighting anyway.
And these would be released daily in the New York Times. There was, so many documents. And so the Nixon administration tried to get the publication of these documents stopped. But the Supreme Court ends up taking up this case. They rule in favor of the press, which is a huge win for the First Amendment and a major blow to trust in leaders.
And the residual effect here is that many Americans asked, if they lied about Vietnam, what else have they lied about?
All this brings us to the final stages of the war. In 1973, the U.S. signed the Paris Peace Accords and officially began withdrawing, but peace didn't really last, because South Vietnam ultimately is going to fall in 1975.
And this Fall of Saigon, it's broadcast live. U.S. helicopters are shown on TV, airlifting personnel from the embassy rooftop. Desperate South Vietnamese civilians clung to the skids. It was chaos and finality. And I mean, for me, it brings up a memory of U.S. leaving Afghanistan. I mean, there's a
Exactly.
lot of
Absolutely.
similar images there.
And you guys are much, much younger than I am, and you have seen that footage, that TV footage recorded. I saw that TV footage. I was 8 years old when that happened, when people were desperately trying to leave the embassy and holding on to that helicopter. It was shocking. Um, this is a quote from a U.S. Marine in 1975. "I remember seeing a woman toss her baby over the fence, hoping we'd catch it. She was begging us. That's when I knew we'd lost more than a war." More indeed. 58,000 Americans dead, millions of Vietnamese dead, trust in government shattered. A new term entered our vocabulary, the aforementioned credibility gap.
Right. And this credibility gap is something that we want to continue to talk about over the next couple episodes because there's going to be this question: what's going to be the government's response to this gap? How will the American government respond to a lack of trust among its citizens? So, how do we think about the Vietnam War today? Decades have passed, but its echoes still shape American politics, foreign policy, and overall, really, this public trust that we keep talking about. It's often described as the first war America lost, but that framing alone doesn't really capture the full legacy.
Vietnam really taught Americans to question official narratives that come from the government, to really ask why. Why do we go to war? What does victory even mean? And after Vietnam, we saw the rise of the quote unquote Vietnam syndrome, which was a public reluctance to engage in overseas conflicts without clear goals. Presidents from Reagan to Bush to Obama referenced Vietnam when justifying military decisions.
George W. Bush in 2002 said this about Iraq. We cannot allow another Vietnam. We must be clear in our mission, resolute in our objectives, and honest with the American people.
It's also affected how we think about veterans, how we treat veterans, because unlike World War II, Vietnam veterans returned to a divided nation and they were often met with silence or outright hostility. And in more recent years, there's been a cultural shift toward recognizing and honoring their service, regardless of the war's politics.
In classrooms, Vietnam is now taught as both a military and a moral turning point for the United States, which is a very cautionary tale. In film and media, it's no longer just about the combat, but stories today, as seen in Ken Burns' PBS documentary on Vietnam, focus also on Vietnamese perspectives, the long term impact, and also the voices of protest.
Even phrases we still use, like quagmire, word of the day, mission creep, credibility gap, they come straight out of Vietnam. And in moments of military crisis, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, or even the more recent withdrawal in Kabul, we still hear comparisons to Saigon in 1975.
So, how is Vietnam remembered? Not as a single story. It's a complex web of heroism and horror, disillusionment and duty, protest and patriotism. It's a mirror and it still reflects.
So, what should students take away? Vietnam teaches us about power and its limits, about foreign policy driven by fear, and the dangers of mission creep.
For the AP exam, for our A pushers out there, I mean, we got to remember Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and what it does to war powers. The Tet Offensive, Vietnamization, draft resistance. Again, we're going to say it again: credibility gap, and then, of course, the War Powers Act of 1973, which is going to push back against the powers of the executive branch that come out of the Gulf of Tonkin.
Good tips. And beyond the test, ask yourself this: who speaks for the people in wartime? How should a democracy handle dissent? Who gets remembered and who gets forgotten?
As we begin to wrap up, we would like to thank our sponsors.
Junior Java, a student led coffee and tea company with a mission to make education more equitable worldwide. Every purchase helps support kids in need. Fuel your studies and support a great cause. Check out juniorjavacoffee.com to shop and learn more.
Thanks, Junior Java, for keeping us and history brewing.
Also, big thanks to Cats of Family Dentistry, Scrawny Arms Farm, the Healthcare Group for Women, and Right on Ruben Schlansky College Essay Tutoring. As always, we are honored by their support.
All right, that's it. Thanks for tuning in to APUSH for All. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple iTunes, or even YouTube. And please leave us a review. If you got a topic you want us to cover, send us a message on Instagram at APUSH for All.
Happy 10 episodes, everybody.
Woo!
Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.